Okay, welcome everybody to our budget committee meeting. Today is May 31st, 2023, and I hereby call this meeting to order. Our first order of business is to elect a budget committee chair. Are there any nominations?
Madam Chair, I'd like to nominate Nicole Protowski as chair.
Okay, do I have a second?
I second the motion.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, Nicole Protowski is the budget committee chair. Come on over.
I'll join ya.
And I will hand this over to you to continue on.
Well, thank you, everybody. There we go. That was convenient. All right, so I will start by reading the budget committee roles and responsibilities. So this is what our job here is today. So the following defines the scope and responsibilities of the budget committee as a whole. The budget committee is a group of school board members and citizens that reviews the school district's proposed budget. The committee is composed of the school board and an equal number of citizens. The budget committee is the means for the public to participate in the budgeting process. The public is encouraged to attend because one of the most important purposes of the committee is to take comments and questions from interested citizens. The budget committee receives the budget message and the budget documents from the superintendent. The committee reviews the proposed budget, listens to comments from citizens, and then approves the budget. The budget committee reviews the proposal to ensure that the district is planning to spend money in furtherance of expressly stated district goals. The committee reviews the budget at a public meeting. That's where we're here today. The committee approves the budget at the major fund and function level and sets the tax rate. Once complete, the budget committee refers the budget to the school board and the school board adopts the budget. The budget committee does not approve new personnel, set salaries, benefits, or contract terms for employees or administrators. It is also outside the committee's scope of work to set staffing levels or decide whether or not service or programs should be provided. The budget committee does not make district policies. The budget committee's work is complete after the proposed budget has been approved. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Lyon to present the superintendent budget message.
Thank you. And Gary is going to address the message within his presentation. So I'm going to use this moment to just express my gratitude and all of our gratitude to you, Gary, for the work that you've done this evening in putting this budget together. The consistent comment is that it is very, very thorough and meets the mark of transparency and accountability that we are striving towards. So I just genuinely want to thank you on behalf of all of us for the presentation we're about to hear this evening.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lyon. Sorry, I was a little distracted getting the technology set up there. I was multitasking and listening, so thank you. First of all, I'm just really excited and honored to be here tonight. I want to just first of all start by thanking the community for the generous support of our education levy. It will literally transform the lives of kids in this community for the time when it's renewed for the next 5 years. It's amazing. I want to thank all of the people, many of whom are in this room tonight, who worked tirelessly to pass this levy. And this budget, which I'm honored to present, is so much better than if that levy didn't pass. And I hope tonight is a much more enjoyable conversation because of it. I also need to put a shout out and thank the fiscal team who put a lot of work behind the scenes in preparing this. They've done a really amazing job. They take great pride in their efficient operations. and in working hard to manage the district's finances. And if you're watching tonight, I appreciate each and every one of you, and thank you very much for your hard work. So moving on, moving on with there we go. So I'll be mainly presenting tonight. Dr. Lyon will weigh in for a second on the budget message. And tonight we'll go over these following things. We'll take a look at how we did in this current fiscal year, or how we're doing more accurately. We'll take a look at our enrollment revenue and expenses for next year, an overview of the budget, and then we'll take a look at the levy amount. Once we go through this document, we'll also go through the budget document itself and spend some time in a little more detail. And I'd be happy to take any questions in either of these documents as we go through. Just want to continue to talk about the increased transparency we're really working to put in place and accountability. We've talked about a lot of these things before. The one that's added tonight is a more detailed budget document. It includes things like explanation of accounting structures and account codes and things that make it a more readable document so people who are in the community can more easily understand the document. Easy to read tables that really kind of point out, I think, in clear ways where the money's going, how it's being spent, where it's coming from. It's got the consultants report in there, laying out our fiscal priorities, as well as very detailed reports in the back, including a report on the levy subfund on exactly what's in that fund and exactly what's being expended. So as transparent as possible we can be with this, we've really worked hard to get there. So Dr. Lyon, do you want to just talk a little bit about your budget message, which is included in your packets and in the budget document itself?
Yes, I tried to provide a narrative of what the district has gone through to bring us to the point this year where we had to, in the fall, make $2.2 million in cuts. And then we considered bringing forth the levy, and the voters of Sherwood, the community, supported that levy. And we're very thankful for that. And that enabled us to cast aside what we call the bad budget and put forth the budget that has three overarching objectives that Gary will reiterate in his presentation. Number one, to maintain the 50 staff positions that were considered to be laid off if the levy had not passed. And we've accomplished that. We have retained the 50 individuals. Number two was to replenish all of these sub-accounts, which I know far more about than I ever wanted to, but to replenish all of these sub-accounts to get them back to where they were before this budget deficiency was identified and the need was to address it was there. So we'll get the accounts back. And then the third thing is the most important thing in some respects, and that is to hit these marks over the next 5 years of building back the ending fund balance. And we have a schedule on within this message that we hope to hit. And we want to make sure that's one of the most effective safeguards that we have to ensure that this does not happen again, and that the district can operate with the reserves that are needed to go about its month-by-month business. And the only other thing I would say about the ending fund balance percentages that we put in the budget message that I think is really important to consider is that percentage number no longer becomes a floating number that is baked into next year's budget. And we're trying very deliberately to make that a standalone targeted goal that exists and grows through the years so that we have a very much an eye on that year in and year out. And it's not this amorphous floating kind of budget number that is the result that you calculate at the end of the budget year. We want to be much more precise about that. So Gary will get into all of that in his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon. So it's interesting how things go. Things tend to go in cycles, and it felt like in October, November, December, January, every piece of financial news about the district that I ran into was not great news. And for some reason this spring, for a lot of reasons, it turned around. And so I have a lot of good news to share with you tonight. One is just about how we're doing in the current school year. Last time I presented to you, we were looking at an ending fund balance forecast at about $255,000. Today, we're looking at more like $990,000, a significant change in ending fund balance for this school year. A lot of it, as you can see, is due to revenue. And that came from an increase in our state school fund share from the state for a variety of reasons. For one, as ODE finally, when they reconcile enrollment after they get actual students in chairs in districts, they're able to more accurately forecast our revenue. And we got a bigger slice of the pie out of that because the state enrollment dropped and ours stayed relatively static. So we got a bigger piece of the pie. And there's also some more technical things, reconciliations of the high cost disability fund, reconciliation of last year's state school fund, all went relatively in our direction. And then we had expenses come in a bit lower than projected as well. So all in all, really good news. That makes a big difference going into next year with, I don't want to say a healthy fund balance, but a lot healthier than $255,000. It also gives us some cushion because, we still have a couple months left of actuals and things that can come up. And so it gives us a little bit of cushion there in case things do start to turn the other way. So overall, really, really good news. One thing to point out here, the two yellow boxes, if you look at those, well, there's 3 yellow boxes. But if you look at our total operating revenues and our total operating expenditures, you can see that the district was essentially right-sized by the changes we made this year. By taking those furlough days, by making the reductions we did, by moving things to grant, we were able to stabilize our ending fund balance at about the same level it was last year. Now, if some of the things were unsustainable, like furlough days, those days are back in the budget. The grants have expired, but it is important to note that we were able to kind of stabilize that trend and get expenses in line with revenues. You can also see in the red boxes that a major drag on our status today is still that ending fund balance, which we expected to be at nearly 3.2 and came in at $911,000. But good news on the general fund. This is our special revenue funds. This is where most of our grants sit. There are also other things in here. A lot of these funds are just passed through. The state gives us a grant for $4 million. We take the money, we hire staff with it, we expense it out, and it just is a flow through account for the most part. There are some other things in here. The good news is the yellow boxes once again, sort of tell the story. The top 2 yellow boxes are operating expenses and our operating revenues largely in line with one another. And when you add the contingency to our projected ending fund balance, it looks like it'll stay largely in line with what we had this year. So that's good news as well. The debt service fund, just as a reminder, this is the fund where the district took out several bonds in 2016 and before that to build other schools, and all of these bonds are paid out of this account. We collect property taxes into this account, and then each December and June, we make payments on the debt on these bonds. And so this is the account where those funds flow through. This is another piece of good news. It's not normally good news when you talk about a negative fund balance of $34,000. But we had projected a negative ending fund balance of closer to $300,000 just a couple months ago. 2 things drive this improvement. One is a little bit better property tax collection. Actually, the big driver was I just did not forecast enough for interest earnings. And when you have $15 or $16 million sitting in the bank at the interest rates we're earning currently, it adds up pretty fast and makes a substantial contribution. So all in all, that's good news. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but all in all, good news. And this is our capital projects fund. This is where our bond funds sit. This is what's left over from our collection of bonds for the most part. There's a couple of other things in here, but it's mostly bond funds. And the biggest chunks are left are for curriculum, technology, and maintenance of facilities in line with the bond questions. And so we have projecting just over almost $6.6 million in that fund to start next year. Also good news. So moving on to the next school year, as Dr. Lyon mentioned, there were 3 main financial priorities that the district was focusing on this year. One was maintain the current staffing level. The levy passed on Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, we immediately went to work, calling folks back to work. And I'm happy to report that we got the lion's share of people. We did not lose the staff we expected to lose. We had people who had offers from other districts who put those offers on hold until they found out from us. We had folks who didn't even look for work because they wanted to stay here and work for us. And we're feeling really fortunate to have gotten all those people back. We're honored they want to stay and work for us, with us. And that's really, really good news. The second priority is to deal with these accounts that had deficit balances, and there were several of them. The ones remaining are athletics, bus replacement, and Medicaid claiming. And you'll see in this budget and also in the budget document, there are significant transfers made to do just this. We won't get them all this year, but we'll get the vast majority of them, and we should be able to get the rest of them next year. And then finally, to restore ending fund balance to levels called for in the consultant's report. And this is a really important piece that we need to consider. And those three things are our priorities in this budget. Is just financial health. It's really what this is all about, and keeping our staff intact. So moving on with those priorities in mind, we'll first talk about the June revenue forecast, which was, if you would have taken what I could have come up with as my best possible case scenario, this is about double what I could have thought was the best case scenario in terms of good news. Net state revenues, general fund and lottery revenues, up $1.9 billion since the March forecast. That's just almost an incredible number. Personal kicker at $5.54 billion. And most important for us is the corporate kicker has grown by about $300 million since the March forecast. And that appears to be the piece of this forecast that helped move the budget from $9.9 billion at the state school fund to $10.2 billion at the state school fund. So of all of the news of the economic update or the economic forecast, this is probably the biggest part for K-12 schools. The other part is that those funds from this year will roll into next year as reserves. The state projects to have about $7 billion in cash reserves going into the next biennium. That's nearly 25% of their total budget, which is, I don't recall ever seeing reserves anywhere near that level in the state. And that's good news because that's a good hedge against a potential recession for us if and when that occurs. So in addition, we need reserves. They have reserves. That sets up well for us for the long haul. And then finally, the corporate activities tax, which is a gross receipts tax passed a few years back, that funds some of our major grants. And with that allocation, the receipts from that tax going up by $170 million, $175 million, that in all likelihood means higher allocations in those grants for us. We haven't seen those yet. They're not included in our appropriations or in this budget, but it is a possible outcome, and that just helps us even more financially, do more for the kids and invest more in the things we need to. So this goes to what I just mentioned. After the revenue forecast, the co-chairs increased the budget to $10.2 billion, and this is the number upon which we built our assumption. This is really, really good news. There is, however, a walkout going on in Salem right now, and it is unlikely we'll have the final K-12 budget from the state prior to when we have to approve our budget. We have to approve our budget by June 30th, regardless of what occurs at the state. So we have been assured, however, or encouraged by our partners at COSA and the Oregon School Boards Association to go ahead and budget at 10.2. They think that's a very safe number, and that when things calm down, the budget will be passed, and that's what it will be at. So we're budgeting at 10.2, and we feel good about that number. So moving on to enrollment. Enrollment is really key for us because it drives how much money we get from the state, and it determines how we staff folks. So monitoring our enrollment is really something we spend a lot of time doing. We use two different methods to do this. For one, we work with a demographer that looks at broader trends. For example, they'll look at a new housing complex going in and determine that we'll get 0.97, I don't know the exact number, but it's roughly 0.97 kids per house. So if there's 400 houses going in, then they'll project how many students that means for us and when. They'll also look at birth rates and things of that nature and look at more broader economic things that are going on. We also do our own methodology, which is just simply rolling up this year's enrollment to next year's and doing some historical growth averages. And interestingly enough, the two typically come out recently, I guess I would say, have come out relatively similar. You can see the district's fiscal forecast is at 4709 and Davis Demographics is at 4712. So this does include 62 transfers from other districts. And 62 may sound like sort of an odd number to pick. As of May 1st, we had 62 transfers on the books. These are from the slots the board opened earlier on. We had 62 students apply for those spots. In the current fiscal year we're in right now, our number between May 1st and the first day of school a little more than doubled in terms of the number of transfers. But we wanted to pick a conservative number. We wanted to make sure we didn't overestimate our revenue, so we went with 62, not knowing exactly what was going to happen with those transfers going forward. If we get more kids, our enrollment will go up, and that's much easier to adjust to than our enrollment going down. But we don't get paid just on the number of kids that we have. Who is in our district makes a big difference. So the average daily membership, or ADMR, that's just the number of students who are registered within our school district who attend. The average daily membership weighted, some students bring extra funds with them to help, so the district has the funds required to meet their needs. And that's called ADMW. And then ADM extended, the state gives us, when they calculate our revenue, the higher of two numbers, either this year's attendance, either this year's ADMW or the prior years. And that's to help protect districts against an unexpected drop in enrollment in short notice. So that's important to know. Here's some of the weights that we see in our district. So for example, a student on an IEP, we would actually receive twice the funding for as a student who's not on an IEP. And a student who's eligible as an English language learner, we would receive 1.5 times what we would receive for a student who doesn't fall into that category. So these factor in quite a bit into our ultimate funding. And as you can see in the current fiscal year, our ADMR is 4690. We have 4,690 students, but our weighted average is 5559. And next year we're projecting 5579. And that's the number upon which we built our revenue estimates and our budget and our forecast. So one thing I want to be sure to explain is why, if our ADMW currently is at 5559 and we add 62 transfers, are there only 20 more students in the district for next year, or 20 more in terms of an ADMW? And the reason for that is because we have an incoming kindergarten class of 269 is our projection, and an outgoing senior class of 452. So when 452 students walk out the door and 269 kids walk in the door, your enrollment is already shrinking, not because people are leaving the district because they're unhappy, but just because of declining birth rates and smaller kindergarten classes. And then we typically pick up a few kids at each grade level who move into the district to attend our schools in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 7th grade, things of that nature. And when you add all that together and it all nets out, that's the number we're projecting is 5579 for our ADMW for next year with those transfers. Any questions about that? Does that make sense? Okay. So the general fund for next year is a lot more fun to talk about than it would have been otherwise. And we wanted to draw attention to the local sources because that local source number is up significantly, and $6.5 million of that is the local option levy that the voters passed just a couple weeks ago. In addition to that, there's another $1 million in property taxes in there, not because we raised taxes, the rate has remained unchanged. There's just growth in assessed value, new homes being built, and assessed value increases by 3% a year. But all in all, the jump in revenue is fairly significant, and it couldn't have come at a better time. When you look at the expenditure side, you can see that our salaries and benefits and payroll expenses, the top two lines, took a pretty significant jump. And when you look at the bottom line and you see the $10 million there, it seems like a large chunk of change, and it is. It's a big amount of money. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this because I think it's important for the budget committee and the community to know about. First, and we'll go through this later in the budget document, the number of staff we have employed next year is virtually identical to the number of staff we have employed this year. This is not because we hired more staff. We are truly at a maintenance level. This is because our costs of doing business went up in several ways. For one, we had about 15 staff members move from grant funds into the general fund, totaling nearly $2 million in salary and benefits right there. On top of that, we had a $500,000 grant that paid for subs last year that was in a different fund, and those substitutes costs have to come back into the general fund. The other thing you'll see on there is a transfer of $1.45 million. We talked earlier about reducing those deficit balances in some of those sub accounts. That's where that $1.45 million is going. So it comes out as an expense, but it's actually paying off and improving our books and cleaning up some issues that we had to deal with. We also have student body funds, which we'll talk about later, coming into the general fund, and that's adding about another $1 million in expense and revenue at the same time. And then we have contingency set aside of $1.6 million, which is essentially a reserve fund that we anticipate rolling into ending fund balance and beginning fund balance the following year. So there is a difference of $10 million, but it's most of it is, and then on top of that, we have increased PERS costs, increased salary costs from cost of living allowance, increased cost of health insurance. All of those normal inflationary costs we feel they're just accelerated a little bit this year. So I wanted to take some time with that, and I want to be sure there's no questions about this, because if there are, I think this is an important slide to just make sure we're all on the same page on. Okay.
We're awake. This just means that we all did a really good job of reviewing and asking questions beforehand.
That's true. I just,
Just so anybody that's listening.
yes,
So
for sure.
Just in case people are listening at home, and just to really emphasize, so a lot of these numbers look like there are big jumps, but those big jumps are really a function of us cleaning out, or us making corrective action, cleaning up some accounts that exist in other categories other than this category, us rebuilding reserves, truing up other expiring, truing up some other account balances that need to be trued up in other areas, and then the kind of whiplash effect of all of the kind of one-time actions that were taken next year. So the difference between last year and this year looks really stark because we did a lot of one-time cuts last year, and now those come back into the current year budget. So the only real change here is all of those things moving around. The net number of FTEs is almost exactly
Virtually identical
from the prior period.
That's a great way of thinking about it. I hadn't thought of it exactly that way, where you had two factors. You had costs increasing because of all the one-time things that we did, and then some of the things we're cleaning up with student body funds and with significant funds and transfers. So I appreciate that, and that's a good way to clarify. Thank you. So this is just a summary of the general fund. You can see we're projecting expected revenue, total resources of just over $68 million, expenditures of $66.7 million, and with a contingency of $1.619 million next year. That's what we hope to roll that and or additional funds into our ending fund balance, which will be the beginning fund balance for the following year. We talked just a little bit about student body funds coming into the general fund, and I wanted to clarify what's happening with that. So student body funds are raised by or for students. They're spent on students, and students need to be part of the decision-making process to spend them. And right now at our elementary and middle schools, student body funds don't meet that definition. And so we will transfer those over to the general fund. This will not change the way things function at schools in any way, except their account code will be different that they charge things to. The main change will be that the fiscal department will now write all the checks for what used to be student body funds that are now district funds. We'll do all the bank reconciliations. We'll manage all the deposits. And it puts all of our internal controls in place over the top of these funds. And so that's an important function, not only to make sure we're in compliance with student body fund law, but just to put an extra layer of protection in there to make sure our funds are being expended as intended and reducing any potential opportunities, or certainly reducing opportunities for fraud. But it will not fundamentally change the way schools operate. It's mainly a fiscal change. The high school also has some legitimate student body funds. And some, like a good example of a student body fund would be if you think about prom, and the student council decides they're going to host prom at XYZ event. It's going to cost $8,000 to rent the event, some more money for the DJ and the food and all of those things. They decide on how much to charge for tickets. Maybe they do some fundraising. The students raise the money's spent on the kids, and the kids decide where to do it. That's a true example of a student body fund. Whereas if a PAC in an elementary student school donates funds to the school for teachers to use in their classroom, the students don't decide how to expend that money. The teacher does, and that's who should decide how to expend that funds. And they may spend it on office supplies, which is something they need, or teaching supplies. This is a cleaner way to do it and the way to go moving forward. Most districts are going this direction. And in fact, there was a big email string going around on the Oregon Association of School Business Officials today about this very topic, and many, many districts go in the same direction right now.
I would add that that just adds another layer of transparency to this entire overall picture. So that's a good thing.
Agreed.
No, and just to echo that, this is just one more financial best practice that you're putting in place over the course of a year where we had some financial difficulties. And I think hopefully for people attending or listening at home, who may not have heard some of our prior conversations, it's really impressive, Gary, the level of attention to detail that you have brought to this process over the course of the year. And I think the fact that, you know, that attention to detail goes all the way down to student body funds should leave everybody feeling pretty confident that not only do we have strong financial control, but it's a holistic approach that's being taken. And it's, you know, from everything to bond levy money all the way down to student body funds. So thank you.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
And I would want to clarify too, when we talk about these funds going back to the district, that no money is being taken away from schools. If a teacher needs to go and buy supplies, that's not good. They're not going to have to go through this whole, you know, system of now jumping through hoops. They're going to be able to go buy the supplies that they need. No money is being taken from the schools or the teachers. It's just being controlled, like you said, in a more transparent way, so that it's able to be tracked easier and fall in line with what the legal qualifications are.
Absolutely. That's a really important point. And that was first and foremost in our mind of how we've done this. We've met with the school administrative assistants who are in charge of the budgets of the schools. We're meeting with them again once school gets out, just to really make sure we're tight on our procedures and we don't have any lapse in service for the schools at all. So that's a good point. I appreciate that.
If I may, Madam Chair, I just want to also clarify that this and other actions that we're taking in order to increase transparency, make sure that we're following the very precise letter of the law and really achieve best practices are going to make our budget this year look like it's inflated more than it has. And so just to kind of really bottom line it for folks, it's important to, if you've got questions, if you've got concerns, please ask us, please ask questions, because this is not an activity where we are now spending more money, or that we're spending money that we don't have, or that all of a sudden the state had this great forecast and now we've got all this money. That's not what's happening here. This is truly a maintenance budget. But when you move funds around and you become more transparent with how you're spending and you put things in the proper place, it can make a budget appear more inflated than it actually is. And this activity of moving money that was once kept outside of the general fund into the general fund makes it look like there's more money that we're spending than there is. And I want to thank the PACs for all they do to make these funds available for teachers to be able to go buy crayons and whatever else it is that they need. That's part of what makes this community so wonderful. So keep doing it.
Absolutely. It's amazing. And we just want to make sure that money is protected and well looked after and being used to the letter of the law. So moving on to transfers out of the general fund. This one relates directly to the district priority number 2 of addressing these account balances with deficit account balances. And there's really 3 that still have, there's 3 that still have a negative fund balance to them. And that would be our Medicaid claiming, our athletics, and our bus replacement fund. Nutrition services, the reason there's a transfer to nutrition services is all school districts with demographics that look like Sherwood's, where you don't receive large federal subsidies for school nutrition services, end up subsidizing their nutrition services department on sub level. We think that's probably an overly aggressive transfer. We won't make that transfer until June of next year, but we wanted authority for what we thought the maximum could be. So that's why that number is set at $200,000. The Medicaid claiming account, for years, the district participated in a Medicaid reimbursement plan where the state, we would go through this fairly laborious survey process where they would survey staff and track time on like given days during the year. And then they would, through a formula, reimburse us for time we spent on Medicaid related activities, such as setting a student or family up to get access to the Oregon Health Plan. That would be a reimbursable activity. And they changed the rules. And we used to receive a couple $100,000 a year for doing that survey. It was well worth our time for that kind of money, and it supported a few different staff members. As the rules for that program changed, as we came out of the pandemic, we started receiving as little as $20,000 or $30,000 a year for that program. And we still had charges of a couple of staff members in there. And so as the revenue didn't match the expenses, the account grew a fund balance that was approaching $300,000. We've since moved those staff into the general fund. That's also part of the reason the general fund is up, is there's more staff members coming into the general fund from the Medicaid claiming fund. And we now need to pay that account off and just close that fund out. And so that's what that $300,000 transfer is. And we'll go into athletics in some detail in the budget document. I think it's worth doing that. But it's run up a significant deficit balance. I do want to make clear that our athletic department or other department did not do anything wrong. They managed the budgets they were giving quite well, right to the number. It was on the district office end that we did not manage things well. I just want to make sure people are clear of that. And it's an issue that we need to address in-house, and we're dealing with it. The other thing that we have is a negative balance in our bus replacement fund. And the reason that that's the case is the board authorized the district to use the construction excise tax fund to pay for bus replacement. The construction excise tax is a tax that is on builders when they build new construction. When they pull their permits, a certain amount of revenue comes to the school district, and it's compensating us for the growth that's coming into our district. And we can use those funds for capital goods, including the purchase of buses. So several years back, the board authorized us to use Fund 291, our construction excise tax fund, to pay for those buses. However, a few charges for buses ended up going to the bus replacement fund, leaving us with a deficit balance because there wasn't a revenue source for that account like there is for the construction excise tax account. So it's just an accounting function to transfer the money over to that account to zero it out. And then we'll just pay for buses out of the construction excise tax account going forward. So the board, you will see that as a resolution in the agenda for the June board meeting to approve us to do that. And that will leave us with a deficit of about $650,000 in athletics, which we believe we should be able to get to zero next year. And then we will have a zero account balance or better in all of those sub funds of the 200 fund. Yes.
Because it made it sound like there was mismanagement in the athletic fund. And just to clarify, those numbers are the result of public decisions that were made to subsidize athletics both during COVID and kind of a repeat. We'll talk more about it later, but there's a repeated kind of subsidy for athletics that's built in to
Yes.
the underlying budget. And, you know, for a few years, that account wasn't trued up to zero, but all of the expenditures that were made were approved through our budget
Correct.
process.
All the expenditures were approved. It was simply a function of not having sufficient transfers into that fund, especially during the COVID years. The first year, the year we opened after COVID was the year. We'll take a good look at it, but that is correct. The funds were expended in the ways they were intended to, in the way they were approved to be expended. We just didn't transfer enough of the district budget in to subsidize athletics the way we needed to for the program level we were offering.
Right. And so getting to the point from earlier, the jump that we're seeing this year is now we're starting to take corrective action for all of those things and just make sure that everything is accounted for the way that it was supposed to be accounted for. It's not that there was money that was mismanaged. It just wasn't.
Correct.
The budget mechanics weren't necessarily the best.
That would be accurate. So moving on to the special revenue funds, this is the 200 fund. Again, this is where most of our grants sit. We will look at it in more detail in the budget document. The main thing here is just to talk about, we do have significant numbers of grants that employ a significant number of people in our district. These are the major ones. There are several others as well that are also important, but these are the 5 biggest ones that we receive. And the top 2 grants are both funded by corporate activities tax, the gross receipts tax I mentioned earlier, that's up by $175 million. And so you can see there, even a small percentage, a 5% increase in those 2 funds would be a significant amount of money. So we'll see what that happens. Stay tuned. But these are great thing, and they do a lot of great things for kids.
If I may, Madam Chair, I just want to point out for the community that while it's really wonderful for us to be getting these additional grants and for them to grow, that this is part of what creates real challenges for the district. When you get a grant, it's unlike the state school fund that's distributed on a formula. We have to put in a really substantial amount of work to apply for these grants. And that takes time. It does take community engagement. It takes a lot of planning. But these grants don't come without strings. There's a lot of real restrictions on how we can spend them. And they can't go to do things like pay an increased water bill. And so I just want to highlight for our community, this is why the levy was so important. But also just that this is the way the state is going, is giving us more directed spending kind of grants that we have to apply for, that we have to do reporting on, that take more administrative work. And that's part of our reality that is changing in a way that is going to make work for this board and staff harder as the years come forward.
No question. We're grateful for the funds, but they produce a lot of work and reporting and application time and bureaucracy to maintain them. And I didn't discuss the new pending early literacy grant that's out there, but that could be up to another $140 million. We're grateful for the funds, but that will be yet another application, another reporting, and another restricted use of funds. We'll take it, but it is challenging. So moving on to debt services. Again, this is where we bring in funds to pay off the district's general obligation bonds. This is a history of our debt services. So I'll just go through this really quickly so you know. On the far left side, this is the fiscal year in which we need to make the payments. You can see the bond amounts are here in this center table. Our total assessed values here and our total average AV growth, and then our levy rate. What's great news for our taxpayers is that when we passed bond in 2016, we projected a rate of just over $4.20 per thousand would we levy each household. And prior to the bond passing, the levy rate was $3.7 per thousand. Last year, our levy rate was 3.43, lower than prior to the bond passing, and almost 80 cents lower than what was promised to the voters. So that's really good news. That was conservative planning by the district and strong AV growth by Sherwood, combining together to make that happen. That's really excellent news. I do want to go back to that slide that I showed. I'll just put the negative deficit for debt services of $34,000. We will have to increase our levy slightly next year, our amount levied next year, to make sure we have enough money to pay that off. But we will still be way down this list, and it will probably be the second lowest levy rate still of any on this list. So it's still, the downward trend will still continue and things look good on that front. And our estimated levy amount is just under $17 million next year to pay off those bonds. So that's the end of the presentation. If there's any comments or discussion now, or we can go move on to the budget document.
Well, one thing that I want to point out when we're talking about levy, because we just passed a levy and there was a lot of talk about the levy, so that there's no confusion. The levy that was passed was set at a certain rate. This, we're talking about the general obligation bond
Yes.
that is also called a levy that was before. So we're not changing the rate that voters approved. Yeah,
Absolutely
just-
correct.
yeah. When you hear levy floating around a lot, people.
Yeah, that's a levy that's been in place for years, and that is separate and distinct and different from the local option levy. That's a good distinction and important to note.
Madam Chair, if I, oh, go ahead. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight again there were increased funds from the state, both at the property tax level. I just want to put very clearly on the record that increased $1 million that we receive in property taxes, that is still equalized by the state. So those funds don't stay here. They are equalized as part of the state school fund formula. Other districts statewide have all seen higher than normal AV growth. So there's a statewide number attributed to that. But it's all still part of funds that are equalized as part of the state school fund formula. So it's not like that's a number that just stays with us. And then the other piece that I wanted to highlight, the revenue forecast really was dramatic. Ridiculous is another word that I use to describe it. It was really a massive increase. But I will say, as somebody who spends her day in Salem talking to these folks about what we're expecting to see, as late as a week before the forecast was released, legislators and staff were being prepared for a flat to slightly down revenue forecast. So these numbers were a shock to literally everyone. No one anticipated those numbers coming. So there is no way that Sherwood could have known or would have done something different had we known these numbers. And in spite of all of that, all of what we see is increased good news, still does not negate the need for the levy. That gift given to us by the voters of Sherwood, absolutely necessary, as necessary today as it was before we knew these numbers. And I just want to make sure that that is very clear on the record so that there's not a sense of, well, if we had just known, A, there was no way to know, and B, because the revenue forecast was released the morning after the levy. I thought I was having a hallucination when I saw that happening. But the reality is we could not have known those numbers, and we needed the levy anyway.
Realistically, 10-2 gets us to a true place of maintenance. And $9.9 billion state school fund was a very lean budget, even with the levy, meaning we were not adding to any reserves. We were not paying down any of those funds, and we were barely hanging on to the staff we had. 10-2 enables us to hang on to the staff we had and improve our fiscal health for the long term.
Just a quick question. You mentioned earlier the consultants report. They recommended a specific amount of reserves that is ideal. Can you remind us what that is?
It's in the superintendent's budget message. I think this year was 2.6% or something.
For 23-24, 2.6%, 24-25, 3.8, 25-26, 5.0%. Those are the consultant's recommendation And then we extended it out 2 more years, targeting in 26, 27, 6%, and 27, 28, 7%. The Oregon Department of Education recommends school districts should have an 8% ending fund balance. So even in 27, 28, we still have some work to do.
And we're pretty close to that amount with our projected fund balance. So moving on to the budget document itself, I'll just go through certain parts of it. I just wanted to point out, I talked a little bit about making it a more readable document, making it a little bit more accessible. I put some information in there about our funds, what they are all for, some accounting structures and program types, so that when people see things at the major fund and major function level, that's what they're looking at here, and they can know what that means.
And this is all available to anyone online by clicking on the agenda meeting, all of these documents that we're going through right now. So even though he might be going through some rather quickly than others, these are all available for your review.
There's also a copy available in the main office for someone who'd like to look at it on paper.
Thank you.
So this is a general fund summary. These are essentially numbers you've seen before. They were in the presentation we just went over, but there it is all on one page. Moving on, this is one of the pieces we put more transparency and more detail in place, where instead of putting this level of detail sort of in the back of the packet, we put it in an easy to read table in the front, and you can really take a look at how revenues changed over time. For example, you can see the $6.5 million for the local option right there in the general fund. You can also see where some of these student body funds have come into the general fund here in terms of revenue. A lot of these things, these private donations and things of that nature, are student body funds that we discussed earlier coming in. Moving on down, you can see that in the past, we've had some prior year. We didn't find out how much money we received for the 2022 fiscal year. So this year right here, 2022, we found out how much money we received in that year from the state in a final number just last week. And they overpaid us by $94,000 for that year. So they took $94,000 out of this year's state school fund. We projected about 300,000 negative. So that was actually a good number for us. But we've shored up our reporting and things like that. And we believe we'll be close to or better than zero next year. I also did want to point out that this large adjustment out here, in this case, the district received a tax receipt from a prior year of like $1.3 million, and that money goes back into the equalization formula. So that was not a problem with an accounting function or anything of that nature. It was just, we got a big receipt and we just don't get to keep it all because it's all goes back into the equalization formula at the state level. Moving on to general fund expenditures. Here you can see just how our salaries increase. We looked at that on the big picture. Here it is on the smaller level. There's some things in here that might be worth looking at. This $384,000 for substitute costs, and this year goes up to $915,000 next year. That's because we had a $500,000 expiring grant. It was a one-time grant from ODE, and that's one of the reasons that things have spiked in the general fund a little bit, is things of that nature. Please don't hesitate to stop me if you have any questions about this I'm going through. You can see our general fund expenditures and materials and supplies went up by about $1 million. A huge bulk of that is the student body funds coming in, because a lot of what those things are spent on are things. We don't spend them on people very often. They spend them on things that go directly to kids. And so that's a big bulk of those funds coming in addition to just some inflationary pressures, which have caused things to increase in price. These dues and fees coming in, this big jump in dues and fees, that is also from student body funds. And those are to pay for things like field trips and things like that student body funds often pay for kids, and they're pretty expensive. Things like BizTown are often donations that cost a fair bit of money, and that's where that money flows through. You also see down here, and this is a part we've really tried to make more transparent, which is the transfers piece in terms of just really being clear on where the money's being transferred to, where it's going, what fund it's heading to. And you can see that large expense of $1.45 million in transfers. This is our special revenue fund summary. Again, this is largely what you saw before. And you can see, I think the biggest thing here, the drop in anticipated revenue next year from 15 million to 13 million. And that's the function of some of those expiring grants and that money going back into the general fund, those expenses going back to the general fund. There's a summary of our major grants. And here's the athletics fund summary. And this one is worth taking a couple minutes to talk
Gary,
about.
before we go.
No, thank you.
Sorry, I don't think I've been doing that, and I didn't know that I was supposed to. Just before we get to athletics fund, just one more comment to kind of echo. As we've been talking through this, there's a lot about, Salem formulas and Salem grants and bureaucratic hoops, and all of these things make it difficult for us to make the investments that we want to make as a district, and make us have to try to contort into the things that Salem wants us to invest in as a district. And so one of the things that having a pool of money that's raised in Sherwood and stays in Sherwood is now we get to fund Sherwood priorities and not Salem priorities with those funds. And I think, over the short term, Salem money, some years it goes in your favor, some years it goes, we'll have years coming up where it's going to go against us. But the thing that we now have, and which a lot of the districts that we consider our peer districts have had for years, is money that we control to be able to fund our preferred priorities, not necessarily Salem's priorities, or not necessarily, whenever Salem gets around to reconciling out this account or that account, or equalizing, money away from Sherwood into other districts. That this is us having some control over investments that we want to make and that Sherwood parents are asking for. And so I just a lot of this was overly confusing, and that is overly confusing for everyone in trying to plan for this stuff. And one of the benefits of having levy funds going forward is that we get to prioritize our own decision-making.
Absolutely.
Not necessarily be at the mercy of all these formulas and grant applications and,
And
forms.
strings attached.
Yeah, all the strings that come attached with that.
Yeah, it's new money, and it's money that we can choose to do exactly what we want with. And that's super exciting. I don't ever remember that time in my career before, and I've been in this business for a number of years. So it's really a great thing.
Hey, Gary, one other thing. So I wanted to just highlight that this is a ton of detail, going back to the transparency thing that we haven't had in the past. So, this has been available to us for a few days. We've been able to ask you guys some questions, which you guys have also came back with some great answers. One of the things I just wanted to call out, and one of the questions I had was just on the water bill. And you look at it like it went from 660K in 2023 up to 911,000 in 2024. And some of that was work that we had to do as a district to save money this year, and then we'll pay back next year. But can you talk a little bit about the water bill and the things that the district did this year versus next year?
Absolutely. So you may recall that I talked at the beginning about how in September, October, November, we kept getting some not so great news. Well, one piece of news we got in, October or November from the city was that working with Clean Water Services, our high school hadn't been properly audited to account for all of the fixtures in the building. And so we got a notification that our water bill in the time of absolute financial crisis was going up by $160,000. This wasn't within the city's control. This was related to Clean Water Services and the law, and the city was able to defer those costs for us for a year. And so we have to make up those costs this year. So we'll have the $160,000 increase next year, plus what we added on for this year, plus what we deferred this year. And so that's why there's a huge spike there. So that's a good question. I meant to talk about that, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, I think the key thing to call out here is that, we asked a ton of these questions, and you guys had answers that supported the reason for these growths. And, it's not written out on each one of these line items. This is the reason why it went up. but when we challenged it and we asked those questions, you guys had good answers. So if the public has questions about these different accounts as they're getting this increased level of visibility, yeah, come ask questions and talk about it versus making assumptions.
Please do. Yeah, I'm easy to find online and I'd love to talk to you.
And we very much appreciate the partnership with the city that made that conversation possible. And they pitched right in and responded to our need at the time. And that was very much appreciated by the city manager and his staff. So thanks to them.
For sure. Okay, so going back, we went through special revenue funds. We talked about the summon. These are the same grants that were listed in the presentation. And we were moving on to the athletics fund summary. And so this one's worth spending a little bit of time on. Again, I want to make the statement again for folks who may have just tuned in. Our athletics department, our athletic director did not mismanage any money. They spent the money that they were given. And I'll walk through what happened here. But the problem was not on the level of spending in athletics. It was on the levels of transfer from the district to the athletic fund, especially during the pandemic. And so we'll take a walk back about 5 years here, 6 years. So starting in fiscal year ending 2017-18, we started that year with a balance of negative $302,000. We collected $171,000 from students. The district transferred in $367,000. Our total revenue was $530,000. Our total expenditures were $538,000. Our total expenses were $530,000. And we reduced that fund balance by about $9,000. You can see we decreased it further into fiscal year 20, getting pretty close to eliminating the negative fund balance. Then the pandemic happened. You can see our program revenue took a significant drop. That's because we didn't have spring sports and we didn't charge athletes for sports. But by law at the time, we still had to pay our coaches. So the district made a fairly sizable transfer, didn't bring in too much revenue, and the account balance went up to $244,000. Then in fiscal year 21, that's where the jump in the balance really took over. We had zero program revenue because Sherwood, like other districts in the metro area, waived fees for athletics in that year to try to help families out as best we could. The problem is we didn't transfer any funds either. And so we added $493,000 to the deficit there, not because athletics didn't spend wisely. It had to do with the district transfer and the lack of revenue that came with it. And then we've transferred insufficient amounts of money the last couple of years, and this balance has grown slightly. I think the hitting a negative 1.1 million is probably a worst case estimate, but I wanted to go with the worst case estimate for the purpose of this budget document. But you can see that when we transfer our $950,000, we make a big dent in that revenue in that deficit from negative 1.1 million to negative 653,000. And we believe that next year we'll be able to get that to zero and clean this whole thing up. Are there any questions about that?
Hey, Gary, you talked about like the nutrition fund and how we stacked up against the neighboring districts. Could you say something about the athletic fund and where we think we are compared to our neighboring districts? I'm assuming they went through similar challenges as it relates to COVID.
You know, I haven't researched what happened to them during COVID. My guess is a lot of them plan to use their federal relief funds, the ESSER dollars for those. And districts all around us got far more ESSER dollars on a per student basis than we did. So a lot of districts were planning to use ESSER dollars to offset things of that nature, maybe by expending something ESSER funds on something else and then using general fund dollars to do that. Districts had a lot of money then. We did not have that much money, but I haven't looked at their balance sheets to see how they're doing. But as far as I know, most districts operate athletics on an annual basis and they don't run a deficit balance. In fact, it's in the general fund in most districts, not in a separate sub fund. And if it's in your general fund, you can have a negative overall fund balance. And so we do eventually plan to move this into the general fund and manage it a little bit differently. But I don't know if that totally answers your question.
Yeah, it helps. Thank you.
Okay, moving forward here.
One
Oh,
One
I'm
more.
sorry.
question. So just to make it really clear with that transfer from other funds is that's a recurring subsidy from the general fund to athletic programs at the district.
Correct.
Correct. And, as a parent of young children in the district, my kids don't participate in activities at the middle school and high school, but we don't necessarily have a systemic analysis of subsidies for all types of student activity. Like one of the things that's great about the new transparent budget documents that we're getting to see is that it calls this out, that athletics do get this subsidy. But one of the questions it raises is, the way we subsidize all activities for all students who participate in the wide range of different programs that are at schools at all levels. And so, one thing, I don't know that we can do it here, but one thing for, parents who might have a question about that at home, as well as just for future knowledge, it's probably worth looking at that in more detail and understanding, how do we want to go about subsidizing student activities, and how are we doing that in a way that's fair to all families, no matter how they're participating across the district.
Couldn't agree more. That's something we've talked about and we need to take future action on. But I agree, we need to take a look at it, and athletics receives a pretty healthy subsidy, and we need to look at other programs as well.
Gary, a quick question for you. On the athletics fund, you talked a little bit about, you believe by next year we'll be able to kind of be at net zero, a balance coming out of the negative situation. Looking kind of just on a puts versus takes perspective, obviously we're starting with a negative 1.1, we're ending with a 653 balance, negative 653. Resulting in kind of a 400K, 450K drive out, if you will, towards kind of that base zero. Is that feasible next year as well, just on projections and getting to a balance of zero? What additional, I guess, controls or concerns should we be aware of and kind of getting to that point? Do we expect the transfers in to be essentially equivalent for the following year as well?
I would think so. The difference is we won't have a $300,000 Medicaid claiming fund to pay down. So the thought process was, by the time we add this 450 and we add our Medicaid claiming fund to it, that we could cover that amount. And, all of it depends on how revenue and expenditures come in and how things shake out, but that would be a best guess for now that we could probably cover that.
One last question on that, if you don't mind. In 2019, there was a much larger transfer than in any other year. Was there a one-time event that occurred there that you're aware of?
I'm not clear on why that transfer was larger than the others. Likely a plan to try to get that deficit balance under control back at that point in time, but I don't recall that, and I don't remember. I'm sorry. I know that I know the history of it a little bit, and in terms of the transfer came, if you look back at that transfer, there was some credits service credits we get from the ESD, which we bring in as revenue every year. And some of those credits were transferred to that fund to cover that expense. But I don't know the rationale beyond trying to pay that down of why that one was larger than the other ones. And to me, the related question is, why did it not continue at that level? And the transfers were just insufficient. And I don't know why they didn't continue at a higher level, why they weren't budgeted at a higher level and recommended to the board to be budgeted at a higher level.
Yeah, and just as a budget committee / board member during that period of time, we didn't see this level of detail to be able to look at this and say, why aren't we tending to that, or what's necessary? What's the plan to be able to do that? So this is a vast improvement to be able to see into this fund, have a sense of what we have transferred, and frankly, now to hear the plan for us to get that balance to zero and then move it to the general fund where we can't carry a negative balance. So this can't repeat itself.
And moreover, now, not only do we have a really well thought out plan, but that plan is documented. So, in the future, if someone looks back at what we're doing here today and ask questions about what we're doing, it's going to be really clear to them, not only what decisions did we make, but why did we make those decisions and what did we plan to do in the future, so that people can hold us accountable for that. And, that's really good work by Gary and his staff to pull all this together and make sure that we actually have everything explained, not only for in the room, but for posterity as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was the intent of putting just this one-off fund in there. It's the biggest problem we have, and so we called it out front and center. So the plan is clear and we're accountable for fixing it. The debt services summary, this is just basically a repeat of what you saw before, with just a projection next year of what our revenue and expenses will be. The one thing is, we do need to build up a little bit of reserve in this fund. And so you can see that contingency on the bottom line of 800 to 899 of $283,000. Our payment is typically due for this fund in the middle of May, but we're still collecting taxes in June, July, and August to make the payment. And so we need to make sure we have enough funds in the bank to make the payment. So we'll do that over the course of a couple of years instead of trying to get it all in 1 year. Just a summary of our capital projects fund. Largely matches what you saw earlier, just with the projection out to the end of this year. We project we'll have about $6.6 million for capital projects. And again, that includes mostly curriculum, technology, and maintenance of our buildings, and any construction we would want to do in line with the bond question. This would be hard to display on one sheet, but this is all fund summary by function. So this is the whole thing. I think one thing that might be interesting to look at for folks at home and on the budget committee is that the FTE that's associated with each one of these is listed on the far right side. So you can see how many people are employed in each one and where that money is going. One thing I do want to point out is support services. Support services includes things like maintenance and things of that nature, but it also includes instruction is only people who are teaching. Things like counselors, mental health specialists, other people who work with kids in different ways that aren't in the classroom are counted in that 2,000 support services line. So I just want to point that out, that those are still a lot of folks working with schools, but this gives you a good sense of where those money were spent and how many are spent out of grant funds and how many out of the general fund. And that takes me to my final.
Hey, Gary,
Yes, ma'am.
is that instruction line, does that include IAs?
Yes, I believe it does.
Okay, thank you.
And then I think this is a slide that it's worth taking a look at for just a second. So this compares the total staff in fiscal year 23, which is the current year, to fiscal year 24 next year. And you can say that the difference is just about 2/3 of a staff member, and our enrollment's expected to increase by about 20 kids. So really, truly a maintenance levy. The other thing you can see on here is that there are 15 more staff members in the general fund next year than there are this year, and 15 fewer staff members in the special revenue fund. And that's the function of those staff members moving from a grant fund into the general fund, causing our cost to spike.
So just to really emphasize this point, here on the total FTE, we started the meeting by talking about a lot of great news, as far as possible, fingers crossed, funding for the district. The budget we're approving, all of that great news is going to end up replenishing our reserve funds, and it's not, being used to fund programs. It's, just to echo what you just said, it's a maintenance budget, and from here on out, any good news that we have gets held in reserve to build those back up after the events of the last year or two.
Absolutely. And then the other thing are the three tax and levy rates that we are asking for approval on tonight as well. I just wanted to be clear with what those were in the budget document. So the district's permanent rate That goes into the equalization formula. That rate stays the same. We cannot change it. We do not change it. We do not set it. All Oregon districts have their own permanent rate, and that goes into the state school fund. And so the district still needs to approve that permanent rate each year. The second rate that we'll ask for approval on tonight is the local option rate of $1.50 per thousand. We've talked about that a fair bit. That's the amount approved by the voters, and now it needs to be approved by the budget committee and adopted by the board. And then we also have to just do a district general obligation bond levy amount. And that's the amount of funds we need to levy to pay off the district bonds. And you can see that number there at $16,890,635. So questions or discussion, anything you'd like to talk about before we move forward?
Well, I just want to say, after being on this committee for a few years, I've never gotten a packet like this. This is the level of detail and what you give us now. It's striking. So I felt like I understood. I felt like I was up to speed, and I didn't realize what I didn't know until I'm seeing these explanations and seeing it laid out so well. So I can see that the jumps you've made already and just what you're giving to us, what you're presenting is leaps and bounds above what we've had in the past. So I really appreciate that transparency, even to the point where it's easy to see where the local option levy is, where that falls in the equation, and everything's just laid out. I've never seen this level of detail. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's been
Any
really
other-
fun actually to put this one together.
Any other discussion or questions for Gary? Go ahead.
Madam Chair, do we have public comment before we? Okay.
No public comment.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I was just checking to see if you want a motion.
Yes, I was just confirming we do not have any public comments, and with no further discussion, I think we're ready for that.
Madam Chair, I want to, with huge thanks to the voters of the Sherwood School District, make a motion to approve the 2023-24 levy of the district's permanent rate of $4.8123 per $1,000 of assessed value. Further, to approve the local option levy for $1.50 per $1,000 of assessed value. And finally, to also approve the levy amount of $16,890,635 for debt service.
Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That is an 8-0 count. And I believe you skipped the back. And we also need to.
We will also need a motion to
a
approve
motion
the
to
budget
approve the
itself.
budget.
They were written in
Madam
separate
Chair,
We're
lines.
excited.
I move that the Budget Committee adopt the proposed budget for the 2023-2024 school year as submitted by the superintendent.
I'll second that.
All right, we have a motion. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? All right, that is also 8-0. All right,
So I just want to, before we depart here, first of all, thank you for approving the budget, much appreciated. But more important than that, thank you for your service, Budget Committee members. I've really enjoyed and look forward to working with you in future years as we go a little bit deeper in this process. I've enjoyed your input and your thoughtfulness and the emails and questions you've directed to me offline and online. Much appreciated. Thanks to the board as well. And thanks again to the community for making this a really fun budget to stand up here and present.
Madam Chair, if I may, I should have included this under deliberation, but I do want to share a thought that I shared with Gary and staff yesterday. I think it will be really important for this budget committee and for the budget committees to come to figure out how to put together an annual report to the community. It does not need to be extensive or particularly bureaucratic, but to really report out to the community about the levy funds, what they raised, how they were spent, how true to what was promised they met, and then any additional information on kind of the financial health and continued efforts towards transparency. I think we've had a lot of conversation about that in this last year, and it's been very healthy. And I think the more that we can kind of put that into a narrative and help people understand it, as opposed to having to try and go through all the budget document. While they're welcome to do both, I think having one that's in more of a narrative form may be very useful.
Also, just hearing that conversation and knowing the conversations we've had with the city and how important the school district is to some of the city's economic development goals. We should think about partnering there to craft that report in a way that it not only informs current Sherwood residents about the great things happening at Sherwood schools, but future Sherwood residents and future, Sherwood employers who may be thinking about where they want to locate. And, one of the things that the levy is going to allow us to do is to offer programs that are on par with some of the municipalities that we're competing for in business location type questions. And that could be a really powerful tool to give the city's business development department as they go around and meet with people and make the sale for locating in Sherwood.
Absolutely. Appreciate those thoughts. Very helpful.
Well, I just want to say too, I think that's a great idea, just like we did with the bond. Any more community oversight I know is welcome at the district level. You guys have been saying over and over how you want to be transparent, you want to have conversations, you want to be approachable. So I think that would be a great opportunity for people to jump in. There is at least one opening on the budget committee that will be coming up. And so if you've been engaged in this conversation, if you've been paying attention, you want to get involved, the budget committee really is a great way to do that. I just want to thank you, Gary and Dr. Lyon, for your hard work in all of this. As a budget committee member, the first interaction I had with Dr. Lyon was a phone call last fall with really bad news. And I thought that this year could have gone a lot worse than it did. So thank you to the voters. Thank you for the community that rallied to really make this meeting much more pleasant than it could have been. So as someone with a graduating senior who is out the door, we are wrapping up our time in this district, but I am just so incredibly thankful for the time that we have had and really, really excited about the future and what opportunities are going to be available for these kids coming up because of the support that this community shows. So thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your participation. Anything else? With
Maybe one more. Unfortunately, the budget committee can't make staffing decisions, but if we could, I would hope that whoever is in charge of PTO maybe slips Gary a couple extra PTO goals next year to make up for what was a very challenging budget year.
That's very nice of you. I appreciate that.
I think he's earned a day or two. Yeah. Yeah, I just really appreciate that. With that, our next two dates are no longer needed since the budget has been approved. So June 21st will be the, no, we're good with that. So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thank you.